Having a spunding valve allows us to ferment in the keg as well as capture CO2, the byproduct of fermentation. After you've built or bought your spunding valve, it's important to check it for leaks, and I'm assuming that you've done that. The next step is to test your spunding valve, your pressure readout, against a known good regulator. I know this regulator to be accurate with another CO2 regulator I have. So you want to hit your keg, and it's filled with beer or water, it's fine. This will just save you CO2 going in because it will only fill up the headspace. So I've set my known good regulator to 20 psi, and I went ahead and I've taken the adjuster and I've run it all the way in. The adjuster runs up against the spring that pushes against the valve and keeps it closed. So this won't let any CO2 out. So I'll first hit my keg with 20. Okay, I hear it rush in there. It sets the lid. After it reaches that 20 psi, I'll take off the disconnect and put on the spunding. Again, we should be leak-free at this point, and because we have the adjuster run all the way in, you won't hear any hissing. So let's go ahead and see what the readout says. This gauge reads 15 psi, whereas my other two CO2 gauges read 20. I did this video to show that there are discrepancies and we shouldn't necessarily take all the equipment we have at face value. So in the future, when we reference this, we're gonna add 5 psi to every measurement we give. So now that the spunding is set, now that we're showing 15 psi or actually 20 psi, you're gonna take your coarse adjustment screw and you'll back it out until you hear a hiss. When you hear that hiss, that means that the spunding has been set to 20 psi. I chose 20 psi because that'll give me approximately 2 volumes when the beer is done, and I like my beer around 2 volumes. Something to consider, however, is that BYO magazine says that anything over 15 psi is detrimental to yeast health, whereas White Labs, a yeast company, says that your psi, the maximum should be 35. So there's even a discrepancy there. In the beers that I have fermented in the keg with a spunding valve with 20 psi as the maximum, I haven't noticed any poor effects from the spunding valve and the fermentation. To reiterate, we've got a spunding valve adjusted to 20 psi, which means any production over 20 psi will be let out by the valve, and as long as we don't mess with it, we won't have to make this adjustment again. Most people know what a leaky lid sounds like, but just in case you don't, I went ahead and I hit this O-ring with a little bit of water, and I've intentionally not clamped it down. So with only 5 or 10 psi, we should hear a little bit of a leak. After that, I'll go ahead and I'll clamp it down, and then I'll hit it with 30 psi, and hopefully we'll hear a distinct kind of click. And that signifies that the lid has been set properly. Okay, we heard it very, very briefly, but then, and you can't see it in the camera, I saw the lid come up at me and actually set itself, even without the latch. So I'll go ahead and take this off, and I'll bleed what CO2 is in there. And it didn't take much, but this time I'll hit it with considerably more CO2, say maybe 20 or 30 psi, and we should hear, or hopefully we will hear, that distinct click. No distinct click there, but no bubbles either, or no hissing. So what we would do is we would wait on this, assuming this were an empty keg. If it kept PSI overnight, We came back and it was the same. That means there are no leaks.